Welcome back to Grumpy Vet Garage. This is my father-in-law's 2008 Nissan Titan with the 5.6 liter V8, and he's been having trouble starting this vehicle consistently. He's changed the battery, actually changed the battery, I think, no, actually only changed it once, but yeah, just trouble starting it. Sometimes it will start right up, and then sometimes it struggles. Well, finally it has gotten to the point where it doesn't want to start hardly at all. It appears to be a starter issue, but again, I don't want to jump to conclusions. We need to kind of look into it. So I have it here in my garage, actually out front of my garage. So 5.6 liter V8 Nissan engine, and the starter on these engines are actually underneath the intake manifold. So it's going to be not a too bad process. It looks like it's actually not that bad to get the intake manifold off. So in this process of getting to the starter, we're going to go ahead and disconnect the battery. So negative, then positive. And then we're going to come over and remove the intake and then kind of see where we're going to go from there. Just cover the terminals with a little bit of tape just so that nothing slides back on to the battery and makes the connection, because these, as you can see, they want to roll right back up because that's where they go. So just a little bit of tape. And then there's really no way that anything's going to connect back to the positive or the negative terminal. You could also just remove the battery, but then you're needing to find where you're going to actually store the battery. And seeing as how we're working over here and not over here, best place for the batteries are actually right where it's at. Okay, now we're going to work to just remove this this tube right here. So I may end up needing to actually take the top of the air box out. So I disconnected, which I believe is mass airflow sensor. I don't believe this is working on speed density. It should be mass airflow. But this clip here, I'm going to try to remove it. You don't want to just get in there and go ham on it and try to break it out, because you're going to want to reuse it. So a combination of like needle nose pliers and then a trim removal tool can usually get you to, get one of these clips out without being too aggressive on them. You're just wanting to pop, see, just like that, a little squeeze and then a little pull, and then this is free. And as you can see, the mass air, you can leave that right in here in the actual air box. So then it'll come out like an assembly like that. So right here, you can see, this is actually going to be a coolant line. So the throttle body is actually warmed up by coolant to kind of help with idle, especially at cold starts. So I'm going to attempt to not actually open up this system. So I very well may just disconnect the actual drive-by-wire feature of the throttle body, because again, there's no throttle cable here. This is only ran by the ECU. So your gas pedal is like a potentiometer that will actuate your throttle body. It's not actually physically connected except through electronics. So I'm going to disconnect this, remove the throttle body, but try to leave it off to the side. So when we pull the intake, maybe we can leave this connected so that it doesn't leak coolant out, and then we have to get to coolant. So this cover that goes over the throttle body, it just comes off with 10 millimeters. My father-in-law already had pulled this off for whatever reason, but then it's held to the actual intake with more 10s. So you just want to hit that and get that out of the way. Okay, so the throttle body, it's a 5 millimeter. So now we're just going to start trying to peel things back from the intake. So there's a breather going down for emissions. We're going to disconnect those most likely at the down at the valve cover. Your dipstick, we're going to need to go ahead and disconnect that bracket. Hopefully be able to leave that as is, but kind of pull it back. And then there's this various wiring that attaches to the rails. Also all the pigtails for the fuel injectors. We're going to need to remove all those. And then coming to the other side, this bracket is attached to the intake manifold. So we're going to disconnect the connector and then work this back so that this harness can stay here. And again, same thing, disconnect the injectors. And then there's something like purge related, I'm assuming, that we're going to have to disconnect here. And then of course, this is the return for our fuel system. So I've disconnected this harness or this connector right here. Like, I know this is mass air over here, but in many cases it's best to start labeling things. So a little bit of blue painter's tape and a Sharpie, you can label this plug on driver side of intake manifold. So I'm going to start disconnecting fuel injectors. How I like to think about it, just so I can number them properly. Imagine you're in the driver's seat looking forward, and your left hand is always going to be the odd numbers and the right hand is going to be the even numbers. So moving front to back, number 1, number 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And even though they may not be able to get mixed up, I still just go ahead and label every single pigtail, just so I know for a fact that I'm putting number 1 back on number 1, number 3 on 3, 5 on 5, 7 on 7. And then additionally, think about how much heat these plastic connectors have been seeing. So don't be too crazy with them. Be kind of gentle as you try to unlock the injector. Just a small pinch and a pull is all you would really need. And then go ahead and label this injector. Something simple is like number 1 FI for fuel injector. So I assume this was return line. I'm assuming now it has to be the feed line. I cannot find another line. So maybe I'm wrong, and I'll annotate on the screen if I am for sure. But to disconnect this, you rotate this over, and this is just a retaining clip. You can pop this off and then set it to the side. So these are just basic fuel line disconnect tools, plastic ones. I'll leave a link in the description for these, but that's what you're going to need to disconnect this line. Also, you're going to need to get a rag because fuel is very well going to spray from whatever's already in this system. You can deplete some of this, pulling a relay, running the truck, but in many cases, you're still going to get fuel out of here. So find you a towel that you're ready to throw in the trash and cover that as you pop it loose. So these lines just kind of, this line removal tool just kind of pops around, and then you try to get it to drop into the actual hole. Finding the right size is usually the hardest part. So yeah, you can see I put on the actual tool, and you got it to pop back. It hasn't quite cleared the O-ring, so this is where the rag's going to come into place. So just kind of pull it over, and then as you pull back, it should spray something. And yeah, a little bit. Not, I wouldn't say spray as much as it just kind of trickled out. But you can see right there, it needs to be depressed. And a tool like this is what will do it. It's kind of a pain, but it is what it is. And the one I ended up using was a 3/8. But these sets are so cheap, you really just want to buy a full set. Okay, so famous last words. I believe I have everything disconnected around the manifold. So coming around to the front, I'm leaving this hose for the fuel injection connected. This is going to stay. Fuel line is disconnected, and I tucked it over there. This is a breather that's connected to the intake, and I'm taking it with it. But you can see all of these are disconnected. And then if you come over to the other side, same thing. Everything's disconnected. Here's the breather. I disconnected the dipstick. This might be a vent. I'm not quite sure. I'm pretty sure dipstick, but wiring's all disconnected on this side. Now I'm going to attempt, and again, famous last words, to start removing the intake manifold bolts right here. And they're in between each runner. They're 10 millimeter, and it's going to take a little bit of time, but I'm going to try to remove this manifold. A quick thing to remember before removing the manifold would be if you have a lot of debris down in the valley here, you're going to want to try to remove that. I just used a simple leaf blower to blow the stuff out. Granted, just cover your intake with your hand and then blow down the valley just to get trash that might be in there out, because you don't want it going into your cylinder head when you remove the manifold. So I've removed the 5 10 millimeter bolts on the driver's side. On the passenger side, I ended up removing this bracket. It's 2 10 millimeters that hold to the side of the intake. It was preventing me from getting to 2 of the bolts. So go ahead and pull this out of the way. It's real easy. And then the bolt all the way in the back on the passenger side is a little bit difficult to get to, but totally doable. But with that done, the intake manifold comes free. Now, what you have in the back here is for the brake booster, and that needs to be disconnected. I'm going to disconnect this actually at the booster. So with the brake booster hose disconnected, you can tuck it up here and then lift the manifold out as a unit. Underneath here, you can see the sealing is actually like individual O-ring style gaskets. Of course, those will need to be replaced, and we need to clean this manifold up. Okay, now it's really good to come in with a vacuum and to make sure to get any of those little bits of things that might still be here, because you don't want them going down into individual ports. And then additionally, you're going to want to get a flashlight and look down in the ports and just verify nothing else has fallen that you didn't notice, so that we can make sure there's no problems down here. So we've gotten the bulk of the stuff on top. I'm still going to need to do further cleaning, but I'm comfortable now moving around and not worrying about something falling into the ports. But now I need to look in each individual port. So here is the starter underneath the intake, and you can see this wire here. This is your signal wire that's coming from your ignition to actually trigger the starter to work. And then this is the actual power cable that runs into this junction block right here, which I got to check it. But this cable runs in this harness straight over to the positive terminal. This right here is the cable. So there isn't actually from what I could tell, there isn't actually a fusible link between there that disconnects, because it's connected straight to this post. Now, we never had a problem where when you would turn the key that it wouldn't at least click, which tells me that there is a signal going. The starter wasn't firing. So we're going to pull out this junction block, check it out, but it's pretty apparent to me that the problem here is going to be the starter if all this wiring checks out. So trying to check to make sure the cable is good, I got out my handy dandy, not really all that new multimeter, got her turned on, got it set to ohms. One thing you always want to do with a multimeter to make sure you even have good leads is check the resistance between the leads themselves. I know these probably need to be replaced. So they're sitting at 0.2 to 0.3, which is not really good. You'd want to have 0, but I'm going to go with this. So 0.2 is automatically going to be in these leads. Pulling this off right here, the connection to the back of the starter, touching it there, and then coming over to the actual battery terminal. I have the same resistance that I have through the leads. So there really is little to no resistance in this cable. Now, on the back side of the engine back here is a bracket. And on that bracket has the lead. The trigger lead for the starter is on this connector. I can't get this free, so I'm going to disconnect this bracket, spin it around so I can actually look at the connector. Because again, these are old plastic connectors that you really don't want to be too rough with and break. So I'm going to try to pull that around so I can disconnect this cable. And then, so disconnected the trigger wire. Now I got to work on the cable and then mounting. So the main nut there on the back side of the starter is a 12. I went ahead and removed the wiring junction from the starter. That's held on with a 12 millimeter coming from the back forward. And now I'm trying to get the mounting. The mounting is a 14 millimeter, and it's coming from the back forward as well. And it's on there pretty good. I'm expecting that this actually might be the hardest part so far. Okay, this is what I was able to figure out. So this is just a basic 14 millimeter combo wrench, and this is a dead blow hammer. There's enough room to get this bolt or this wrench in there with it angled back towards the front, and with tension being placed on it, makes small strikes, and I was able to break these bolts free. I can't think of any other way to explain this other than be patient, and this kind of sucks. So here's the bolt, very specific looking, actually. A much larger head on it, which is also nice to make sure you're not going to strip it. And here is the starter. So of course, now that I've gotten to this point, there's a phenomenon called the while you're in there effect that usually takes effect. So I'm going to go ahead, see, and so I'm already down here, and I'm going to clean all this stuff. I'm going to go ahead and check spark plugs. Actually, I'm going to change spark plugs. So I'm going to start disconnecting coil plugs, because this is a coil unplug system. and I'm going to remove the coils, check them, make sure they look good, and then I am going to pull plugs, check those as well, and then I'm going to start replacing spark plugs too. So painting down, you can see the coils. They're retained by a single 10mm bolt, so I'm going to pull all the 10mm bolts that are holding the coils down. So this wiring bundle right here has a retainer, and it's going over the top of both coil plugs in the back. So I'm going to go ahead and unbolt this out of the valve cover. Again, 10mm, 10 millimeters everywhere, and be able to manipulate this to get it out of the way of the coil plugs. Okay, I'm going to attempt to remove the individual coils with the plugs still intact to see if it will lift and come off that way without having to disconnect each individual coil, because very well I'm not going to need to, but yeah, so I'm gonna give it a shot. And yeah, they come out pretty easily as is. There was no misfire on this vehicle, so I don't expect that I'm going to need to replace any coils, but I'm just kind of looking at them as I pull them out. So over here, this would be cylinder number 2. I think you can see that on camera, a large amount of oil. So when you have this amount of oil, 99% of the time, we have a valve cover leak issue. So it's going to be pretty obvious, I think, to you that everything that's happening on the passenger side of this truck is more difficult to get to than the driver's side. But this number 2 here is leaking very, very bad. So yeah, that's going to require it to be addressed, because that type of thing is what will cause a misfire if it was to corrupt the coil. So I ended up getting a little bit of education on how Nissan valve covers work. The actual center spark plug hole seal is built into the valve cover. So if this valve cover is leaking and we only have one cylinder leaking, you actually have to change the whole valve cover, because the seal for those holes are actually built into the cover. So it's really not that big a deal. I have to make sure to get some of the wiring away from the cover, and then it's really just remove the bolts for the valve cover. The new valve cover I purchased comes with a new gasket. So again, you don't want to use RTV or any kind of silicone with a supplied gasket, especially the kind that comes on these valve covers. So just make sure the surface is good and clean and use the gasket that comes with the new valve cover. Here's the new cover I purchased. It's just a standard replacement, nothing special. Comes with a new oil cap. I already have the gasket placed into the groove on the valve cover, but you can see right here, you can't change these seals. Those seals are made into the cover. So if you have a leaking spark plug hole, you actually need to change the whole cover. So here, and in the back, there are clips for the wiring. You just need to carefully pry them up with like a trim removal tool, and then that will free the wiring to come back out of the way. I'm labeling these wires that I'm going to disconnect, like this is the cam position sensor. I'm going to disconnect that and then label as much things as I can as required as I pull it back. The valve cover is held on with 12 10mm bolts that need to be removed. So I have all bolts removed from the valve cover. I definitely think this is an easier job because the actual intake manifold's removed. Because just the access and way everything comes up. But you should be able to pretty easily pry this up. I'm going to get a small plastic pry and pry up on the valve cover, but it should come free pretty easy. Seems like this front corner is a good spot to pry it. But yeah, it's already. So now we just need to take our time to clean that surface up and get it prepped to put in the new valve cover. So a bit of a tight area, but the actual seals on the valve cover are going to slip over these tubes. And I just took all the wiring and pressed it back. Here I actually put a zip tie just to kind of hold it back, because we're going to try to lift this up, slide the new valve cover on with the gasket already in the groove, and then have it slide down over the tubes. Okay, I got the new gasket in the groove in the new valve cover. Now I'm going to slip it in. So I cannot find a direct torque spec for this valve cover. Based on the size of the bolt, Nissan would say this needs to be 25 foot-pounds. That sounds like a lot to me. I'm going to go ahead and run them all down hand tight, make sure they're all hand tight, and then I'm going to slowly step it up until I feel like it's appropriate. The key thing is that you just want to be able to tighten it up so that the gasket is flush and sealing up against the head. So I have everything snugged down, hand tight. Now I'm going to come in with a torque wrench and try to step it up. 25 foot-pounds would be like 300 inch-pounds. This inch-pound torque wrench only goes up to 200. So I'm going to try 150 and then go to 200 and see what that is. But really, I'm just trying to snug it all down evenly. So the valve cover is all the way down. I ended up doing 150 inch-pounds. And quite honestly, that even seemed like it could be too much. You're trying not to warp anything, but just get everything down flush. There's a good smash on the gasket, and I'm good with that. I don't need to run it down super, super tight. So I think 25 foot-pounds would be way too much. You really just want to get it nice and snug. Okay, now it's time to go ahead and change spark plugs. The spark plugs that I'm using are NGK Iridium plugs. The part number is right there. These plugs already come pre-gapped, and the gap is 44 thousandths. You can check it, but you really don't want to try to adjust the gap on the Iridium. There's a good chance that you can actually damage them. So you're going to use a 5/8 or 16 millimeter spark plug socket to put in these plugs or remove plugs and install them. And when you torque them in, you're going to torque them to 21 foot-pounds. Okay, all the spark plugs are installed. Coil packs are back on top of the valve covers. And then right here we have our new starter, got a Denso unit. It comes with a new cable that goes to the solenoid. So we actually need to move the cable that's in the box over to the new starter and then install the starter. So with the electrical connection made and the actual starter in place, you need to torque these bolts to 34 foot-pounds. Previously, getting them off, you realize that they were pretty difficult. So I'm still going to use the same method of a dead blow hammer, and then I'm going to put a socket on a ratchet. You got to do what you got to do, but this is the method I'm going to use. Now you can take the trigger wire and reattach it to the clip on the back side of the engine, plug in the connection, and then reattach the bracket on the back side of the engine. So everything's installed. I went ahead and installed new silicone hoses for the intake just because the other ones were cracked and dry rotted. Didn't want to cause a problem. But yeah, everything's back together. Let's see how it cranks. So as you can see, the removal and install of the starter on a Nissan Titan is pretty straightforward. It's a little intimidating when you think about the fact that it's located under the intake manifold, but it is definitely something that you could do in your home garage. If you have any questions about this process or anything I did, please leave a comment and I'll definitely get back to you. If you like this kind of content, please consider subscribing to Grumpy Vet Garage, liking this video, sharing this video. Additionally, we have a Grumpy Vet Garage merch store. This is a Grumpy Vet Garage zip-up hoodie here. We also have t-shirts and pullover hoodies. Anything you buy in there helps the channel to grow. The link to that store is in the description. But thanks for coming and seeing me in my garage, and until next time, have a good one.